And to prepare for that fight, the president shook up his cabinet at the end of October 1975. They called it the Halloween Massacre. Don Rumsfeld became the Secretary of Defense for the first time. Dick Cheney became the White House Chief of Staff. And in an uncharacteristically Machiavellian move, President Ford neutralized a potentially troublesome challenger for the 1976 presidential nomination by firing the Director of Central Intelligence, Bill Colby, and making George Herbert Walker Bush the next Director of Central Intelligence. Bush didn't want the job. He wrote in his diary, Bury, B-U-R-Y, Bush at the CIA, it's a graveyard for politics. And he told President Ford, I see this as the total end of any political future. But Bush discovered actually that he loved running the CIA. It was like Skull and Bones with $1 billion budget. He loved the camaraderie, he loved the secrecy, and he loved the idea that he was going to right the ship, which was listing and in danger of being swamped. Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld and Director of Central Intelligence Bush had terrible confrontations throughout 1976 because Don Rumsfeld controlled most of the intelligence budget and Bush wanted the control. That money belongs to me, Rumsfeld said. Those are my spy satellites. That's my electronic eavesdropping gear, and all intelligence is essentially battlefield support for American soldiers. He's trying to buck up the Pentagon after the fall of Saigon. Bush is trying to buck up the CIA after Watergate and the spilling of the secrets. One of Bush's right-hand men at CIA was an analyst named George Carver, and he said in a very recently declassified CIA oral history that Don Rumsfeld was, quote, paranoid about the CIA and convinced that the CIA was, quote, out to spy on him. And he cut off communication between the CIA and the Pentagon. Don Rumsfeld comes to power, back to the Pentagon, in 2001, innately distrustful of the CIA and its ability to collect intelligence abroad. His successor as White House Chief of Staff becomes the Secretary of Defense under President Bush. The past is prologue. And in the 1991 Gulf War, which remains the only major conflict that the United States has unambiguously won since the end of World War II, in the 1991 Gulf War, you'll remember that back then Saddam really was trying to build a nuclear weapon. And the United States military after the war went into the core of his nuclear weapons directorate, broke down the doors, blew off the locks, broke into the sanctum sanctorum, and they determined in 1991 that Iraq was probably 9 to 18 months away from having its first nuclear weapon detonation. Now, what does the Secretary of Defense think about this? CIA had totally missed it. We had bombed everything there was to bomb in Iraq in 1991. But we missed an enormous nuclear weapons facility. Didn't know it was there. Didn't drop one bomb on it. Dick Cheney looks at this report and he says, I'm paraphrasing, but he says, now here's what the Iraqis themselves are saying. There's this huge facility that was never hit during the war. They were close to making a nuclear bomb. CIA didn't know it. And I'm sure, and so is everybody who knows Dick Cheney, that he said to himself, I can never trust the CIA again on a question of weapons of mass destruction. There's no doubt that the Dick Cheney that comes back into office 9-10 years later has this burned into his memory. Iraq wants a nuclear weapon. They were close to getting a nuclear weapon back in 1991, and CIA hadn't a clue. So at the turn of this century, you have a president whose father ran the CIA, who doesn't have the best relationship with his father, and you have his two most powerful aides, Dick Cheney and Don Rumsfeld, who totally mistrust the CIA's ability to gather intelligence. You've got trouble. There was, in fact, deep trouble at the CIA. At the turn of the century, the CIA was falling apart. And we knew this back in 1998, after al-Qaeda blew up 2 of our embassies in Africa. And back then, the Director of Central Intelligence wrote a report, and he sent it up to the White House. This is George Tenet. And he said, unless we make sweeping and substantial changes in the way we collect, analyze, and produce intelligence information, we will suffer a catastrophic systemic intelligence failure. The date of this report is September 11th, 1998. Three years later, America is attacked. President Bush, Vice President Cheney, and Donald Rumsfeld make a plan for war. They believe that despite the fact that the framers of our Constitution put explicit limits on the power of government and separate those powers among the President, the Congress, and the federal courts, they believe after the attacks of 9/11 that all these powers are gathered in the President. That in his capacity as Commander-in-Chief of the military, he combines the executive, the legislative, and the judicial powers of government in himself. This they believe. Extraordinary claims for power in the presidency are made. The most extraordinary of these are made through the CIA, the Justice Department and the FBI, and the National Security Agency. These claims are largely made through secret orders, secret legal opinions, some of which have been exposed by the press, of which remain secret, but not many. The President, for example, had signed an order on February 7th, 2002, stating, none of the provisions of the Geneva Convention apply to our conflict with al-Qaeda. Okay, fair enough. The President asserts that the CIA and its officers can then use what are politely called aggressive interrogation procedures against detainees. There's a less polite word for this. That word is torture. Other presidents have decided to withdraw from treaties, but no other president has said that the Geneva Conventions do not apply to captives held by the United States. This policy encourages the abuse of detainees and is arguably impractical. The job of the CIA overseas is to recruit foreigners to commit treason against their country and spy in secret for the United States. To recruit foreign agents. It was hard enough during the Cold War, but it was possible to recruit people from the Soviet Union, from China, not from North Korea, unfortunately. But it was possible in part because the United States stood unequivocally for freedom and justice and security and liberty. It is harder today for the CIA to recruit Islamists from the Mediterranean to the Pacific because of this policy. The President also decided that people, including American citizens who were seized by the FBI or the CIA or the military anywhere in the world, could be held indefinitely without resort to the writ of habeas corpus. Congress acceded, but the Supreme Court did not. In 3 separate decisions, the court held that non-citizens had the right to habeas corpus, that military commissions violated American law and the Geneva Conventions, and that American citizens also had the right to challenge their imprisonment. At the heart of these decisions is Justice Sandra Day O'Connor's statement in Hamdan v. Rumsfeld. Justice O'Connor wrote, "We have long since made clear that a state of war is not a blank check for the President." She reminded the President that the Constitution makes the President the Commander-in-Chief of the military, not the Commander-in-Chief of the United States. This is an important principle. The White House fought back with the Military Commissions Act, which Congress passed, and the act sent the message that the CIA would continue to use techniques tantamount to torture, that the military would deny habeas corpus to most, if not all, detainees, and would try and sentence them without judicial review or oversight.